The Castellano estate woke the same way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the house itself resented the intrusion of morning light. Dawn crept through the iron gates like an uninvited guest, touching first the manicured hedges, then the marble fountain that hadn't worked in years, and finally the kitchen window where Grace Okonkwo had already been standing for an hour. She moved through the kitchen the way water moves through stone, patient, persistent, invisible. The coffee was brewing. The newspapers were pressed and waiting. The breakfast settings were arranged with geometric precision, each fork and knife positioned exactly where Don Victor Castellano expected them to be. Not because he'd ever said so, because Grace had spent 4 years learning the architecture of his silences. That's the thing about working in a house like this. You don't learn the rules. You absorb them through your skin, through the way a room goes quiet when certain names are mentioned, through the weight of doors that close a little too firmly. Grace had learned that the Don took his espresso at exactly 6:47 a.m., not because anyone told her, but because she'd watched him check his watch 3 times the first morning she served it late. She was 53 years old. She had raised 2 children alone in Lagos before circumstances, the kind that wear polite names like economic migration, brought her to this country, to this city, to this house where men spoke softly about terrible things and women smiled at funerals. Her hands, which had once braided her daughter's hair and held her son through fevers, now folded napkins into shapes that pleased dangerous men. The house stirred. Upstairs, she could hear the familiar symphony of the Castellano morning, Victor's measured footsteps, his wife Elena's heels clicking against hardwood, their son Marco's door slamming with the particular violence of a 24-year-old who believed the world owed him explanations. Grace wiped down the counter that was already clean. She did this not because it needed cleaning, but because standing still in this house felt like a kind of confession. Movement was safety. Busyness was armor. Grace, she turned. Victor Castellano stood in the doorway, his suit already immaculate despite the hour, his silver hair combed back with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was just another form of power. He was 61, with the kind of face that had learned to hide everything except what he wanted you to see. "Good morning, Don Castellano." He nodded once, the way he always did, not dismissive exactly, but economical. Victor Castellano did not waste words the way other men wasted money. Every syllable was an investment, and he expected returns. "The Marchetti meeting," he said. "It's been moved to Thursday. I'll adjust the dinner arrangements. And Grace—" He paused, something flickering behind his eyes that she couldn't read. The blue tie, not the gray. She nodded, and he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something that smelled like old paper and older secrets. The blue tie. Such a small thing. But Grace had learned that in houses like this, small things were never small. The blue tie meant the Marchetti meeting was a negotiation, not a confrontation. It meant Victor wanted to appear approachable, reasonable, open to compromise. The gray tie, she'd seen what happened after meetings when he wore the gray tie. The phone calls that lasted until 3 a.m., the cars that arrived and left without headlights, the way Elena's hands trembled when she poured her morning tea the next day. Colors had meanings here, silences had weight, and Grace had become fluent in both. By noon, the house had settled into its familiar rhythms. Elena hosted her charity committee in the East Parlor, their laughter too bright and too brittle, like champagne glasses waiting to shatter. Marco disappeared into the city, leaving behind the smell of cologne and restlessness, and Victor retreated to his study, where the real business of the Castellano family happened behind doors that Grace was never asked to clean. She moved through the house like a ghost with a feather duster, past the family portraits where everyone smiled but no one looked happy, past the library where first editions collected dust because no one in this family read for pleasure, past the window where she could see, if she looked carefully, the 2 men in the black sedan who had been parked outside the gate for 3 days now. She'd noticed them on Monday, reported it to no one. That wasn't her place. Grace had learned long ago that in this world, seeing too much was more dangerous than seeing nothing at all. So she dusted the windowsill and moved on, carrying her observations like stones in her pocket, heavy, silent, hers alone. That evening, as she was preparing to leave for her small apartment across the city, Victor called her into his study. The room smelled like leather and old smoke, though Victor had quit smoking 15 years ago. Some rooms hold on to their memories like grudges. Grace stood in the doorway, her coat already buttoned, her bag already on her shoulder. "Close the door." She did. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. Victor was standing by the window, his back to her, watching the evening light fade across the garden. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "How long have you worked for this family, Grace?" 4 years, Don Castellano, come February. 4 years. He turned, and for just a moment, she saw something in his face that looked almost like weariness. "In 4 years, you've never asked for a raise, never complained, never—" He paused. "Never talked." Grace said nothing. There was nothing to say. "The men in the sedan," Victor continued, "you noticed them." It wasn't a question. Grace felt her heartbeat in her throat, but kept her face as still as the portraits on the walls. "I notice many things, Don Castellano. Most of them aren't my business." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "That's why you've lasted 4 years. Most people in your position, they talk, to the police, to journalists, to anyone who waves money in their face." He walked to his desk, picked up an envelope, held it out to her. "This is for you. Consider it a bonus, for your discretion." Grace looked at the envelope, but didn't take it. "With respect, sir, I haven't done anything that deserves a bonus. I've only done my job." Victor's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something else. Interest, maybe. Curiosity. As if she'd just revealed a card he hadn't expected her to hold. "Take it anyway," he said. "And Grace, be careful going home tonight. The roads can be dangerous." She took the envelope, felt its weight, knew, without counting, that it held more money than she'd see in 6 months of normal work. "Thank you, Don Castellano." She left the study, left the house, walked to the bus stop where she'd waited 4 years of evenings. The sedan was still there, its windows dark, its engine silent. Grace got on the bus, watched the estate disappear behind her, felt, for reasons she couldn't name, like something had shifted, like the ground beneath her feet had developed a crack she couldn't see but could definitely feel. The night she vanished, nobody noticed. That's how most endings begin. Quietly. 3 days. That's how long it took for anyone in the Castellano household to realize Grace was gone. Not Tuesday, when her bus came and went without her. Not Wednesday, when the coffee wasn't made, and the newspapers weren't pressed, and the breakfast settings were arranged by Elena's fumbling, unpracticed hands. Not even Thursday morning, when Victor came down for his espresso at exactly 6:47 a.m., and found only silence and an empty kitchen. It was Marco who finally said it, with the careless cruelty of someone who had never learned that words could wound. "Where's the maid? The African one?" Elena looked up from her cold tea. Victor paused with his phone halfway to his ear. And in that moment, in that small hesitation, something changed in the Castellano household. Something that would take days to fully understand, but only seconds to feel. "Grace," Elena said slowly. "Her name is Grace." "Whatever." Marco reached for the coffee pot that wasn't there, found only cold metal and colder air. Did she quit? Finally realized she could do better than waiting on Marco. Victor's voice cut through the room like a blade. Enough. The boy, because that's what he was, despite his 24 years and his expensive suits and his father's name, fell silent. He'd learned long ago that his father's quiet was more dangerous than other men's shouting. Victor set down his phone. When did anyone last see her? The question hung in the air, and its weight was heavier than it should have been. Grace was the maid. Grace was hired help. Grace was the woman who had organized Elena's medication when the doctors forgot. Grace was the one who noticed when Marco was using again, who quietly disposed of the evidence before anyone else could find it. Grace was the one who kept this house running, who remembered birthdays and allergies and which wine went with which guest. Grace was invisible, and now Grace was gone. "Monday evening," Elena whispered. "She left around 7. I saw her walk to the bus stop." Victor's jaw tightened. "The sedan." "What sedan?" Marco asked. But Victor was already moving, already picking up his phone, already dialing the number that connected him to Sal Benedetti, his most trusted soldier. "Sal, the maid, Grace Okonkwo, find her." 24 hours later, they found the answer. Not Grace herself, just the answer. It came in a manila envelope, slipped under the iron gates sometime before dawn, addressed to Victor Castellano in handwriting that every member of the family recognized. Lorenzo Marchetti, the man they'd been negotiating with. The man Victor had worn the blue tie for. The man who had, it seemed, decided that diplomacy wasn't moving fast enough. Inside the envelope, a photograph. Grace, blindfolded, her hands bound with rope, seated in a metal chair in a room with no windows. On her lap, a newspaper dated that morning, proof of life, proof of leverage, and a note, handwritten in Lorenzo's careful script. The docks, the old cannery. Thursday at midnight. Come alone, or she doesn't come home at all. Victor stared at the photograph for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face had changed, not hardened. It had always been hard. Something else. Something that looked almost like grief. Don Victor. Sal's voice was careful, measured. She's just what? Victor's voice was soft, dangerous. Finish that sentence. I want to hear you finish it. Sal swallowed. I only meant the Marchetti situation is complicated. If we go to war over a maid, Victor set down the photograph. A woman who has spent 4 years in my home, who has seen my family at our worst and kept our secrets like they were her own, who has never asked for anything except the chance to work and be left alone? He leaned forward. Tell me, Sal, what is the proper response when a man takes something from you? Something you didn't even realize you were protecting until it was gone? The room went silent. Even Marco, who never knew when to shut up, said nothing. Victor picked up the photograph again, looked at Grace's face, at the dignity that somehow survived the blindfold, the fear, the rope burns already forming on her wrists. Call everyone, he said, every soldier, every associate, every man who's ever owed me a favor. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. Lorenzo Marchetti wants a war. Let's give him one. Elena stepped forward. Victor, don't. He didn't look at her. Don't tell me she's replaceable. Don't tell me she's not family. Don't tell me the practical thing, the smart thing, the thing that keeps the peace. I wasn't going to. Elena's voice was strange, thick. I was going to say, bring her home. Whatever it costs, bring her home. Victor finally looked at his wife. Something passed between them, an understanding older than their marriage, deeper than their differences. I intend to. The next 3 days were the busiest the Castellano household had seen in years. Cars came and went at all hours. Men in dark suits gathered in the study, their voices low and urgent. Phone lines burned with conversations in 3 different languages. And through it all, Victor moved like a general, preparing for a war he'd never expected to fight. Not for territory, not for money, not for the usual reasons men like him went to war. For a woman who had ironed his shirts. Marco watched from the doorway of the study, confusion and something else. Something that might have been the beginning of respect, warring on his face. I don't understand, he finally said. She's a person. Victor didn't look up from the map spread across his desk. She's a human being who came to this country with nothing and built something honest with her hands. She didn't choose this life. We did. And Lorenzo Marchetti doesn't get to use her as a chess piece because he thinks we won't notice the absence of someone we never should have taken for granted. Marco was quiet for a long moment. Is that really why? Now Victor looked up. What do you mean? Is it really because she's a person, or is it because you're worried about what she knows, what she might tell them? The question hung in the air like smoke, and in that moment, Marco saw something in his father's face that he'd never seen before. Not anger, not calculation, but something raw and real and almost painful. Your grandfather, Victor said slowly, used to tell me that a man's character is revealed by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. Grace has seen the worst of us, the secrets, the failures, the moments we'd kill to keep hidden. He paused, and she stayed. Not because we paid her well. We didn't. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She did. She stayed because she's loyal in a way that most people in our world have forgotten how to be. He turned back to the map. So yes, Marco, I'm going to war for a maid, because if I don't, if I let them take her and use her and throw her away, then I'm no different from Lorenzo Marchetti, and that is something I will not become. Not for money, not for peace, not for anything. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. And somewhere across the city, in a room with no windows, Grace Okonkwo sat in darkness and waited. Not for rescue, because she had long ago stopped believing in rescue, but for whatever came next. She'd survived worse, she told herself. She'd survived Lagos, survived immigration, survived a husband who left, and children who grew up, and a world that never seemed to have room for women like her. She would survive this too. She had to. The old cannery smelled like salt and rust and decades of abandonment. Lorenzo Marchetti had chosen the location carefully, a place where screams would echo and no one would come to investigate, where the harbor's black water waited to receive whatever needed to disappear. Grace had been here for 5 days now. 5 days of darkness, of cold, of men who spoke above her head as if she were furniture. They'd fed her twice a day, not out of kindness, but because a dead hostage was a worthless hostage. They'd let her use a bucket in the corner for her bodily needs, turning their backs with the theatrical courtesy of men who wanted to believe they weren't monsters. But Grace knew monsters, had known them her whole life, had learned to recognize them not by their cruelty. Cruelty was common, but by their indifference. These men weren't cruel. They simply didn't see her as a person worth being cruel to. In some ways, that was worse. She'd stopped counting hours after the second day. Time moved differently in darkness, stretched and compressed, expanding into eternities of silence and then snapping back into moments that passed like heartbeats. She slept when she could, thought when she couldn't. Mostly she thought about her children, Amara, 31 now, working as a nurse in Toronto. They spoke on the phone every Sunday morning, a tradition they'd kept for 8 years, through time zones and busy schedules and the particular silence that grows between mothers and daughters who love each other but don't know how to say it. Emeka, 28, still in Lagos, still struggling, still promising that next year would be different. He had his father's smile and his father's unreliability, and Grace loved him with a love that felt like aching. She wondered if they knew yet, if anyone had called them, if they were worried, or if they'd simply assumed their mother had finally gotten too busy to call. The door opened. Light, harsh and sudden, sliced through the darkness. Grace flinched but didn't cry out. Crying out was a luxury she'd given up years ago. Mrs. Okonkwo. The voice was smooth, cultured, carrying the accent of expensive educations and inherited wealth. Lorenzo Marchetti stepped into the room, his suit impeccable despite the surroundings, his silver hair catching the light like something stolen. "I apologize for the accommodations," he continued, pulling a chair close to where she sat. "This wasn't my first choice. But Victor Castellano is a stubborn man, and stubborn men require creative negotiations." Grace said nothing. She'd learned that silence was safer than speech. "You've been with the Castellano family for, what is it now, 4 years?" Lorenzo crossed his legs, casual as a man at a dinner party. "In 4 years, you must have seen a great deal, heard even more." Still, she said nothing. "I'm not asking you to betray them." Lorenzo's smile was almost kind, which made it more frightening than any scowl. "I'm merely curious. What is it like, working in that house? Being invisible? Watching them live their lives as if you don't exist?" "I exist," Grace heard herself say. Her voice was rusty from disuse. "I exist whether they see me or not." Lorenzo's eyebrows rose. "Well, you do speak." He leaned back, studying her with new interest. "Tell me something, Mrs. Okonkwo. Do you think Victor Castellano is coming for you?" Grace thought about the envelope Victor had given her, the weight of it, the words he'd said about dangerous roads. She thought about the way he said her name, Grace, like it was a real name belonging to a real person, not just a sound to summon service. "I think," she said carefully, "that what Victor Castellano does or doesn't do is not my concern." "No." Lorenzo uncrossed his legs, leaning forward. "Even now? Even sitting here, in the dark, waiting to find out if you're worth more to him alive or forgotten?" "I've been forgotten before." Grace's voice didn't waver. "By better men than Victor Castellano, I survived." Lorenzo stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a genuine sound, surprised out of him. "You're remarkable," he said. "Do you know that? Most people in your position would be begging by now, making promises, offering information. But you—" he shook his head. "You sit there like a queen on a throne, even with rope burns on your wrists." Grace said nothing, but something in her spine straightened, just slightly. "Here's what's going to happen," Lorenzo continued, his voice growing businesslike. "Tomorrow night, Victor Castellano and I will meet. He'll agree to my terms, the shipping routes, the warehouse territory, the percentage I've been asking for, and in exchange, I'll return you to him, unharmed. And if he doesn't agree?" Lorenzo's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes went cold. "Then I'll send you back to him in pieces, starting with your fingers." The words hung in the air like a held breath. Grace felt her heart rate spike, felt the fear she'd been holding at bay crash against her ribs. But her face remained still, her voice remained steady. "My fingers," she said, "have spent 50 years working, cooking, cleaning, holding children while they cried." She met Lorenzo's eyes. "If you take them, you take everything I've built with my own hands, everything I've given to a world that never gave anything back." She paused. "Is that really what you want to be remembered for? The man who destroyed a grandmother for business leverage?" Lorenzo's smile flickered, just for a moment, just enough. "You're trying to make me see you," he said slowly, "as a person, as someone with a story." "I'm not trying anything." Grace's voice was tired but steady. "I am a person. I do have a story. Whether you see it or not doesn't change what's true." The room went quiet. Outside, Grace could hear the harbor, water lapping against concrete, gulls crying in the distance, the endless patient rhythm of the sea. "My mother worked as a maid," Lorenzo said finally. His voice was different now, softer, stripped of performance. "In Florence, for a family much like the Castellanos. I was 7 when they fired her, 8 when she died." He stood, straightening his jacket. "I tell myself, that's why I am the way I am, that it's their fault, the rich, the powerful, the people who look through people like you." He walked to the door. "But sometimes I wonder if I became exactly what I hated, if the boy who loved his mother would recognize the man standing here now." He opened the door. The light sliced across Grace's face. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we'll see what Victor Castellano thinks you're worth." The door closed, the darkness returned, and Grace sat in silence, feeling something she hadn't felt in days. Hope, not for rescue, not even for survival, but for the possibility that somewhere, in someone, a crack had formed. And cracks, she knew, were where the light got in. Thursday midnight came wrapped in fog. Victor Castellano stood at the entrance to the old cannery, his coat buttoned against the harbor wind, his hands empty as Lorenzo had demanded. Behind him, invisible in the darkness, 30 men waited with weapons they were ordered not to use unless signaled. This was not Victor's preferred approach. He liked overwhelming force, clean executions, the kind of violence that sent messages no one could misread. But this was different. This was Grace, and Grace was still inside. The cannery door opened. Lorenzo emerged, flanked by 4 men, his smile visible even in the dim light. "Victor," he spread his arms wide. "You came. You expected otherwise?" "Honestly?" Lorenzo tilted his head. "Yes, I expected you to send soldiers, lawyers, perhaps a very expensive hitman with good references." He paused. "I did not expect the great Victor Castellano to come himself, for a maid." Victor's face betrayed nothing. "Where is she?" "Inside, unharmed, as promised." Lorenzo stepped closer. "But first, we discussed terms." "No?" The word hung in the air. Lorenzo's smile flickered. "No? No terms, no negotiations, no percentage of shipping routes or warehouse territory." Victor's voice was calm, conversational, almost bored. "You took something that belongs to me. You're going to give it back. And then you're going to pray that I'm feeling merciful." Lorenzo laughed. "Victor, please. You came alone. I have 4 men. I have your leverage. What exactly are you going to—" "I'm going to tell you a story." Lorenzo blinked. "I'm sorry?" "A story." Victor began walking toward him, slow and measured. "About a woman named Grace Okonkwo, 53 years old, born in Lagos, raised 2 children alone, came to this country, all with nothing but a work visa and hands that knew how to labor. Victor, she worked in my house for 4 years." Victor kept walking. "In that time, she never complained. never asked for raises, never spoke about what she saw or heard. She kept my family's secrets like they were sacred. And do you know why? Lorenzo's smile had faded completely now. His men shifted, uncertain. Because, Victor continued, Grace Okonkwo is a person of honor. In a world, in our world, where honor is a commodity to be traded, she kept hers intact. Not for money, not for loyalty. Simply because that's who she is. He stopped, close enough to Lorenzo now that he could see the other man's pulse jumping in his throat. You asked me once what it would take to go to war with you, what price would be high enough, what insult would be severe enough. Victor's voice dropped, became something cold and sharp. The answer is standing in a room inside this building, blindfolded, hands bound, treated like a piece of furniture by men who don't deserve to breathe the same air as her. Victor, Lorenzo's voice cracked. Be reasonable. She's just... The next person who tells me she's just anything will not live to finish the sentence. Silence. Even the harbor seemed to go quiet. Here's what's going to happen, Victor said. You're going to bring Grace out here. You're going to untie her hands yourself. You're going to apologize to her, not to me, to her, for every hour she spent in darkness. And then you're going to walk away. No deal, no negotiation, just the knowledge that I could have ended you tonight, could have had my men open fire the moment you stepped outside, and chose not to. Why? Lorenzo's voice was barely a whisper. Because Grace wouldn't want that. Victor's jaw tightened. Because she would look at me the way she looks at my son when he disappoints her, and I would know that I'd failed to be the man she somehow still believes I could be. For a long moment, no one moved. The fog rolled in from the harbor, wrapping around them like a shroud. Then Lorenzo turned and walked back into the cannery. 5 minutes later, he emerged with Grace. She walked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the light, her hands still bound but her back straight, her chin raised. Even now, dirty, exhausted, her dress torn and her hair wild, she carried herself like someone who had never learned how to be small. Lorenzo cut the ropes himself. His hands were shaking. I'm sorry, he said. The words came out rough, reluctant. For what it's worth. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Looked at this man who had kept her in darkness, who had threatened her fingers, who had treated her like a piece in someone else's game. It's worth nothing, she said quietly, but I'll take it anyway. She walked past him without looking back, walked toward Victor, who stood waiting with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something that looked almost like humility. Grace. Don Victor, He stopped, started again. I should have protected you better. Yes. Her voice was steady. You should have. I'm sorry. I know. She walked past him too, toward the car waiting in the darkness, and Victor turned to follow, leaving Lorenzo standing in the fog with nothing but the echo of his own failures. Inside the car, the silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at the city lights passing by. Victor sat beside her, closer than propriety allowed, not quite touching, but present in a way he'd never been before. Why? Grace asked finally. Why did you come yourself? Victor was quiet for a long moment. My father told me once that a man's character is revealed by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. He paused. I realized, when you were gone, that I had failed that test, every day for 4 years, and I had the arrogance to believe I was better than men like Lorenzo. Grace considered this. You're not better than him? No, but you're trying to be. She turned to look at him. That's worth something. Is it? I don't know. Grace's voice was tired. Ask me again when I've slept in a real bed, when I've eaten a real meal, when I've called my children and heard their voices. Victor nodded. The house is ready for you. Elena insisted on preparing your room herself. My room? Grace blinked. I have a room. I have an apartment. You have a room, Victor said firmly. In the main house, for as long as you want it, and Grace. He met her eyes. You're not the maid anymore. You're family. If you'll have us. The words hung in the air like something fragile, like something that could shatter if held too tightly. Grace looked at this man, this dangerous man, this powerful man, this man who had just gone to war for her, and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not trust, but something adjacent to both. "I'll think about it," she said. "Ask me again in the morning." Victor almost smiled. "Fair enough." The car drove on through the night, and somewhere behind them, in a cannery that smelled like salt and rust and something newly broken, Lorenzo Marchetti stood alone with his failures. The harbor water lapped against concrete. The gulls cried their endless hungry cries, and the world turned on, indifferent to the small victories and smaller defeats that happened in its margins. 3 months later, the Castellano estate looked the same. The hedges were still manicured, the fountain still didn't work, the iron gates still opened and closed with the mechanical precision of old money and older habits. But inside, things had changed. Grace still woke before dawn, still made coffee, still arranged the breakfast settings with geometric precision, but now she did it at a table in the main kitchen, not the servants' quarters. Now she ate her meals with the family, not after them. Now, when Victor came down for his espresso at exactly 6:47 a.m., he poured her a cup too. "Morning, Grace." "Morning, Victor." First names. It had taken a month for her to stop calling him Don Castellano, another month for it to feel natural. Now it rolled off her tongue like something she'd always known, like a truth that had just been waiting to be spoken. Elena joined them, her hair still wet from the shower, her smile easier than it used to be. She kissed Grace on the cheek, a habit she'd developed in the weeks after Grace's return, a small gesture that said more than words. "Sleep well?" "Like the dead." Grace paused. Poor choice of words given the company. Elena laughed. Victor almost smiled. And somewhere upstairs, Marco's door opened and closed with slightly less violence than it used to. The boy had changed too. Not dramatically. He was still impulsive, still entitled, still convinced the world owed him more than it had given. But he'd started saying, please, started noticing when people entered rooms, started just occasionally asking Grace for advice on things that had nothing to do with ironing or cooking. "He asked me about love yesterday," Grace told Elena later, as they sorted through the household accounts together. "About how you know when it's real. What did you tell him? That real love doesn't make you feel small." Grace's hands paused over the papers. "That it doesn't ask you to be invisible." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you stayed, after everything?" Grace considered the question. Considered this house, this family, this world she'd never chosen but had somehow become part of. "I stayed," she said finally, "because I was seen. For the first time in 4 years, maybe for the first time in longer than that." She looked at Elena. "I stayed because Victor Castellano, for all his sins, did something that most people never do. He went to war for someone who couldn't give him anything in return. He valued me before I proved I was valuable." "And that's enough?" "No." Grace's voice was honest. "It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's a start." The afternoon passed in the rhythm of ordinary things. Grace called her children, Amara in Toronto, Emeka in Lagos, and for the first time told them where she really worked and who she really worked for. Amara was horrified. Emeka was fascinated. Both made her promise to be careful. "I'm always careful," Grace told them. "That's how I survived." In the evening, she walked through the garden, a habit she'd developed since her return, a way of reminding herself that she was free to walk where she pleased, that no one was watching her from a sedan with dark windows. Victor found her there, standing by the broken fountain, watching the last light fade across the hedges. "The Marchetti situation is resolved," he said, "permanently." Grace didn't ask what that meant, didn't want to know. "Good." He sent a letter. "Lorenzo, before—" Victor paused. "Before the resolution. It was addressed to you." Grace turned, surprised. "To me?" Victor handed her an envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful script. "Mrs. Okonkwo. I have spent my entire life blaming others for what I became. My mother's employers, my father's absence, the world that told me I was worth nothing until I made myself worth fearing. You sat in that room, in the dark, with nothing but your dignity, and you made me feel ashamed in a way no amount of power has ever made me feel strong. I don't know if I believe in redemption, but I know that I will remember your face for the rest of my life. I will remember what it looked like to meet someone who refused to be small. I hope you find peace. I don't expect to. L." Grace read the letter twice, folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket. "What did he say?" Victor asked. "He said goodbye." Grace looked at the fountain, at the water that never flowed, at the marble that gathered dust and weathered storms and stood anyway. He said goodbye, in the only language he knew how. They stood together in the fading light, the powerful man and the woman who had spent 4 years being invisible in his house. They didn't touch, didn't need to. Something had shifted between them that went beyond physical proximity, beyond the usual boundaries of employer and employee, beyond the neat categories the world used to keep people apart. "I'm thinking of fixing the fountain," Victor said finally. "Elena's wanted it working for years." "It would be nice," Grace agreed. "Hearing water instead of silence." "Instead of silence," Victor nodded. "Yes, that's exactly it." The stars came out, one by one, scattered across the sky like small truths waiting to be noticed. Grace watched them and thought about all the nights she'd spent in darkness, not just in the cannery, but in her life. The nights of worry, the nights of work, the nights when the world felt too heavy and the morning felt too far away. She had survived them all, and now, standing in a garden that didn't belong to her, but somehow felt like home, she understood something she'd been too busy to notice for 53 years. Survival wasn't about endurance, wasn't about keeping your head down and your mouth shut and your expectations low. Survival was about finding the people who saw you, really saw you, and holding on to them with everything you had. Victor saw her now. Elena saw her. Even Marco, in his clumsy way, was learning to see. And Grace, who had spent her whole life being invisible, finally felt the weight of being visible, of mattering, of taking up space in the world like someone who deserved to be there. "Don Victor," she said quietly. "Yes? Thank you." The words came out rough, unpolished. "For coming for me, for seeing me, for—" She paused. "For everything." Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, stripped of the performance that usually armored it. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for giving us a chance to be better than we were." The fountain didn't flow, the hedges didn't move. The world remained exactly as it had been before. But something had changed, something quiet, something real. Grace walked back to the house, leaving Victor alone with the stars and his thoughts. She climbed the stairs to her real room, with a real bed, in a house that finally felt like it belonged to her, as much as she belonged to it. She sat by the window and watched the city lights blink in the distance. And for the first time in a very long time, Grace Okonkwo did not feel invisible. She felt seen. She felt safe. She felt at last like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The night settled over the Castellano estate like a blanket, soft and heavy and full of all the things that don't need to be said out loud. And Grace closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would wake before dawn. Tomorrow she would make coffee and press newspapers and arrange breakfast settings with geometric precision. But tonight she would rest. Because she had earned it. Because she deserved it. Because even silence has a sound if you've survived enough. And Grace had survived. That was the beginning and the end of everything.